This is VOA Africa.
Good evening, I'm Esther Gidhu. It's Thursday, June 20th. This is Africa 54. On this World Refugee Day, a closer look at how the worldwide refugee crisis is impacting Africa. How women refugees in Cameroon are being empowered by mobile money. And a grassroots movement to help the public better understand refugees is growing in the United States Capitol. Thursday is United Nations World Refugee Day. It's commemorated each year on June 20th. The day honors the strength and courage of refugees and encourages public awareness of people who have fled their homelands due to conflict or natural disaster. This year's theme is Step with Refugees. Africa 54's Paul Ndiho tells us more.
Every minute, 20,000 men, women and children are forced to flee to escape persecution, violence or terror. Many of these people find themselves in Uganda, the host of 1.4 million refugees, and that number could grow up to 1.8 million by the end of the year, according to the United Nations High Commission for Refugees. Approximately 74% of all refugees are from South Sudan and the Democratic Republic of Congo. Over 3,000 people who had sought a sanctuary in the UN protection sites during various conflicts are expressing the desire to return home, according to the United Nations.
When they go back home, they're now free to do other things like cultivation, farming, fishing, business even go back to, some people can go back to school. So we are trying to facilitate them to move on with their lives.
South Sudan was plunged into civil war in 2013 after President Salva Kiir fired his deputy Riek Machar. The conflict uprooted more than one-third of the country's 12 million people from their homes. For the leader of the South Sudanese National Movement for Change Party, it was an emotional return to his home territory after nearly 5 years in exile. He now has high hopes for peace and for his people, who greeted him with enthusiasm.
I'm also very excited to see them after 5 years out of the country. I never left them with hatred. I'm coming back with love and with unity, and let us continue to push the country forward. That is the only message. Never go back to war again. We need peace. If anybody has any intention to go to war, please take care of the vulnerable, the women and children who are suffering. We don't need war again.
It's a different story in Ethiopia. Over 1 million people that were uprooted from their homes by ethnic clashes are still too terrified to return home. 22-year-old Tektel Mehilu is still too afraid to return home, more than a year after his house in Thousand, Ethiopia was razed to the ground, his coffee plantation destroyed and his cattle stolen.
We've seen no peace since Abiy came to power. Peace is the most important thing for a human being, not only to farm, but also to cultivate and eat what is farmed.
Officials insist that what became the world's largest internal displacement crisis in 2018 is now under control, and that more than 1 million people have returned to their homes. However, there are warning signs that dire humanitarian conditions exist and are only set to get worse.
More than 1 million people have displaced from different directions. So, like this one, there are a number of highly vulnerable and affected areas. So, we addressed only highly vulnerable people with intensive targeting.
Since coming to power in April 2018, after more than 2 years of anti-government unrest, Ethiopian Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed, himself an Oromo, has been hailed for his efforts to end the iron-fisted rule of his predecessors. He has embarked on economic reforms, allowed dissenter groups back into the country, and under his leadership, an easing of control has seen Ethiopia jump 40 points in the 2019 Press Freedom Index. But tensions remain between ethnic groups who are divided into 9 autonomous regions. Some have boiled over. usually over land and resources, leading to deadly violence in the country of over 100 million people. Paul Liho, VOA News.
Tens of thousands of Cameroonians who fled their country because of political turmoil are now living in Nigeria. Nigerian authorities say more than 35,000 refugees have arrived in the country since 2016, but refugee advocates say the number is more than 70,000. Nigerian officials say they will begin voluntary repatriation of some Cameroonian refugees. Timothy Obiezu reports from Abuja.
Ernest Cho was a merchandise trader in Cameroon before he fled the country with his two sons to seek refuge in Nigeria. Cho is among more than 437,000 Cameroonians forcibly displaced by unrest in the southwest and northwest regions of the country. Now in Nigeria's capital, he's trying to get a fresh start.
My home in the village, virtually nobody is staying there. We don't have a single life in my house in the village. Everybody has been displaced.
Some 35,000 Cameroonian refugees are in Nigeria, according to the United Nations Refugee Agency, UNHCR, and Nigerian officials. But refugee advocates say that figure is more than double, an assertion Nigerian authorities dismiss.
That's 5,000 only from Cameroon. But as I mentioned, we have refugees from other parts of the world. So it's not, in our records, we do not have 70,000.
Nigeria, like many of its neighbors on the continent, is affected by both internal displacements and the refugee crisis. More than 2 million people north of the country are displaced from their homes and living in temporary camps because of attacks by a militant Islamic group. Hundreds of others have sought refuge in Chad, Niger, and Cameroon. UN and ECOWAS authorities say returning refugees home will not be easy.
The reason for which they have run away needs to be solved. When you talk, for instance, of Cameroonian refugees, if they feel excluded from the national politics, it is only at the point when the situation in their country that they will be returning.
But until lasting peace is restored in Cameroon, refugees like Ernest Cho will be away from home for a long time. Timothy Obiezu for VOA News, Abuja.
Food aid in Cameroonian refugee camps is being replaced by a mobile money payment. This system allows refugees to choose what food they buy, and it helps women so they don't have to rely on their husbands in the mostly polygamous society. From Gado, Cameroon, and Mirel Nzwankeu filed this report, narrated by Moki Edwin Kinzeka.
Jenabu Abdullahi, a Central African Republic refugee in eastern Cameroon, no longer has to ask her husband for rations of food aid. Instead, she does her weekly shopping with aid money for refugees that was transferred directly to her mobile phone.
The program helped us a lot by giving us a lot of capabilities. As we are a polygamous home of 3 women, before it was our husband who went to take food for all of us and shared it with us. Now every wife has her phone. She benefits from the assistance for her children and herself, and she uses it as she wants.
Aid agencies in Cameroon introduced the cash-based transfer program in 2016 to increase the efficiency of refugee support.
The WFP is currently assisting 48,000, just about 48,000 refugees via cash-based transfer. And one of the main reasons why cash is becoming more and more important in the humanitarian context is for WFP, it gives the beneficiaries the choice of food to select in the food basket that's available.
The mobile payment system is not unique to Cameroon, but for the mostly polygamous CAR refugees, it has been empowering because every wife is treated as head of a household and receives a monthly allowance.
The program allowed me to take care of myself, to solve the problems of my family. Now I no longer depend on food assistance. Thanks to this program, I can take care of my children's school fees and equip my house.
While limited by telecommunications, the use of mobile cash transfers is expected to grow and give more refugees choices about aid they receive. For Anne Zwanke in Gadu, Cameroon, Moki Edwin Kinzeka for VOA News.
Uganda is home to Africa's largest refugee population, over 1.2 million people, and 36,000 of them are unaccompanied and separated children. Refugee families are not only torn by war and conflict, but by poverty and domestic violence. Halima Thumani reports on the plight of child-headed refugee families in Adjumani, Uganda.
16-year-old Selila Miyala's family in 2013 fled fighting in South Sudan to a refugee camp in Uganda. But 3 years later, her parents returned home, leaving the children in Uganda. Now Miyala heads the household.
I came with my parents, but my father beat my mother, so she left.
The United Nations Refugee Agency says more than 36,000 refugee children in Uganda are unaccompanied or separated from their parents. While most broken families were torn from years of conflict in South Sudan, domestic violence and poverty also play a role.
Parents are looking for opportunities around, moving around, often creating tensions within the family. In some cases, you have perhaps, the wife receiving more support, being able to provide more support than the husband, and that's already a situation of tension in families.
Ugandan authorities say foster parents take care of the unaccompanied or separated children when possible, while authorities search for the parents. But there are also too many child-headed refugee families like Miyala's.
Then we take care of them as child-headed families. Yeah, but if they are within the country, the long arm of government always catches up with the parents, and they are apprehended and persecuted and also disciplined.
The Ugandan Red Cross last week helped track down Miyala's mother in South Sudan, where she had remarried.
We managed to get their contact of their mother, and through their phone call service, we managed to restore the links, the contact between the mother and the children. And also we discovered that the mother now has started sending some assistance to the children.
As for Miyala, she looks forward to the day when she can safely return to South Sudan and no longer play the role of both parents for her brothers and sisters. Halima Athmani for VOA News, Adjumani, Uganda.
Now, for more insight on the refugee crisis, I'm joined by Johanna LeBlanc, a security and foreign affairs legal analyst. Johanna, it's great to have you in the studio. Welcome back to Africa 54.
Thank you so much for having me again. I appreciate it. It's an honor to be here on this such momentous occasion.
Now, being a momentous occasion, this year's theme is Step with Refugees. What weight does this theme hold?
I think that the whole notion of Step with Refugees, I think that holds significant amount of weight, right? Because when you think of the term STEP, right, it means to come together, right, to find out what the issues are, what the concerns are, and so that we can address them accordingly. As we know, refugees right here in the United States face significant amount of challenges when they arrive here in the United States. So telling folks from all across the United States to come alongside with refugees and to find out how can we better assist them to ensure that they indeed remain and become productive members of society is critical. And I like how we're using social media, right, as a way to get the word out. Hashtag Step with Refugees. I think that's an important component when you're trying to send a message to the world. And I'm pretty sure this hashtag is probably trending all over the world. So I'm really excited to further engage in this discussion about refugees in the United States.
Johanna, you're staying with us, so we're going to go back to that in a few minutes. We're excited to hear what you think about Africa 54. Join the discussion on Facebook. The address is Africa 54. We're also streaming our broadcast live on Facebook. Please watch and share our show with your friends. Also, check out our headlines 24/7 on voaafrica.com. Still to come, telling the human stories behind the world refugee crisis. We'll be right back shortly with more from our guest, Johanna LeBlanc. Stay with us.
The lyrics could be French,
English,
but
Portuguese,
Bantu,
Arabic.
It is the beat.
The African beat that counts.
The beat does all the translations.
It cuts across all languages and gives us the understanding that this is the African beat.
It is so distinct
and adhesive.
It binds us together.
African Beat on the Voice of America. For more information, visit our website at www.voanews.com/AfricanBeat.
I am Sheikh Sali, host and senior editor of VOA's international call-in talk show, Straight Talk Africa.
Today we'll examine the tobacco industry.
We pretty much touch on anything that you can think of. Politics, health issues, human rights issues, you name it, we talk about it. The issues that we discuss are pertinent to most people on the African continent. A very, very rare and unique opportunity to interact with their leaders.
The United Nations Refugee Agency, in a newly released report, says nearly 71 million people worldwide are displaced by war, persecution, and conflict. The UNHCR says this is the highest level of displaced persons since the agency was established nearly 70 years ago. VOA's Latza Hoke has the details.
More than 300,000 people have fled ethnic violence in northeastern Democratic Republic of Congo since early June. UN officials say more than 160 people were killed in clashes there between farming and herding communities in just the past week.
As the displacement continues at this massive scale, fears are more people will try to seek safety in Uganda, crossing Lake Albert.
Most people who are forced to leave their homes hope to come back, even those who have spent much of their lives in a refugee camp, such as this Palestinian in Jordan.
There is no way we will give up on our homeland. This is impossible. The future generations will not give it up. If we die, there are others, right?
But the numbers of those who return are relatively small, and new conflicts, persecutions, crime, and human rights abuses create new waves of refugees. The current number of displaced people worldwide roughly equals the population of France. Most of them are from Afghanistan, Syria, South Sudan, Myanmar, and Somalia.
And when you look at those countries, you can see that both Afghanistan and Somalia have had reoccurring displacement for over 40 years.
Ninette Kelly is the director of UNHCR's New York office. She told VOA that tribal clashes in some countries like Ethiopia and Cameroon cause repeated internal displacement, but some developments are more recent.
And then the other big story, of course, has been Venezuela, where since 2015, over 4 million people have fled.
Kelly said Colombia now has 1.3 million registered Venezuelans and Peru about 800,000. Turkey, Lebanon, and Jordan house the most Syrians. Some countries host foreign refugees, while their internal clashes cause displacement of local populations. Kelly said most people flee their homes only as a last resort when they fear for survival. And this, she said, is the main reason for a large influx of Central Americans at the U.S.-Mexico border.
There are very gripping accounts of situations where neighborhoods are controlled by rival gangs, and where the choice for a young male is you either join a gang and murder others, or you be murdered yourself. And for a young woman, can be conscripted into, trafficking and sexual abuse.
The UN report urges the international community to invest in the economy and security of the countries whose people are forced to flee. Zlatica Hoke, VOA News, Washington.
And joining me again with more perspective on the global refugee crisis is Security and Foreign Affairs legal analyst Johanna LeBlanc. Johanna, let's talk about some of the legal challenges these refugees face in host countries.
So I'll look at this in the context of the United States, right? So when you have refugees come to the U.S., there is pathway to permanent residency and ultimately U.S. citizenship. So let's just make that clear. And I think refugees are aware of that fact. But there are some other legal challenges that they face. For instance, driving laws, right? the laws that protect one in the workplace, right? Healthcare law. So every single institution that you could think of that they will have access to, there are laws that govern them. So sometimes as a refugee coming from your country and sometimes you may not even speak English properly, right? Or speak English at all. So trying to maneuver these different systems, right? And trying to understand what your rights are as a member of this now new society, right? Sometimes can be a little bit challenging. And I think that's why organizations that are created to interact and to provide services to refugees are so critical.
What about Africa? See, like so many refugees are from Sudan, in South Sudan. Some of them living in Uganda, others living in Kenya, and they are drawn from different countries of Africa. You know, what are some of the legal challenges they face there? Because people think probably Africans speak the same language. They all speak different languages, even within one country. What are some of the challenges and how can those be overcome?
You know, and that's a very good question, right? And it's a very loaded question you just asked. There's no easy answer because the fact of the matter is those are individuals who are victims of persecution, right? Or maybe they're from countries that are torn by wars and natural disasters and such, so they have to be displaced and go to a foreign land where they don't even speak the language, where sometimes their rights are not even protected. So in the context of Africa, it's a little bit different than the refugee laws we have here in the United States. But in the context of Africa, I will say, even though we're 54 countries in Africa with different languages, different cultural beliefs and such, we have to embrace our brothers and sisters. We have to ensure that as a host country, we have systems in place to properly accommodate those people so that they can pursue life, liberty, and happiness, because that's all they're looking for.
Now, as you talk about accommodating those people, some of the things you think about if you became a refugee is how are you going to deal with this new place, new country, the psychological effects of a refugee? How do, you know, maybe the UNHCR or medical personnel in various countries help those refugees cope with being uprooted from their home countries, being in a new country and facing all these, you know, numerous challenges?
Yeah, obviously there are psychological implications of having to resettle elsewhere because there are people who they leave their entire families behind and they're in a different new setting, right? They don't know anyone and they're trying to navigate this society, right? And then also you have people who were brutally abused in their country. Now they come with the psychological issues, and we need to ensure that there are systems, there are programs available to properly address the medical and the psychological challenges.
Any easy solutions, you know, very briefly, any solutions at all? Because this is enormous.
You know, it's really hard, right? Because when we think about why some of these countries are in the positions that they're in to the point where people have to flee and go to other countries, we have to look at foreign policies, right? How those foreign policies have, in a way, undermined democracy in that particular country. And we also have to look at how international sanctions have led to the crippling of the economy of these countries to the point where people can't live there. They cannot pursue life, liberty, and happiness, so they find themselves going to another country. So I think that when it comes to the issue of refugees, we have to take a global approach. What role does the West play in it, right? What role does countries throughout the continent of Africa play in this, right? And then that's the only way we will reach a solution. We have to look at who are the key players, who are the decision makers who are impacting the lives of those people so bad that they have to flee their homes and be settled in a society where they don't know the language, they don't know anyone.
Johanna, thank you so much for this excellent insight into this topic. Johanna LeBlanc is a security and foreign affairs legal analyst. Now, as the number of refugees allowed into the United States is reduced by the administration of President Donald Trump, a grassroots movement to help the public better understand refugees is growing in America's capital. VOA's June Saw caught up with a woman who is a driving force behind the movement called One Journey. VOA's Carol Pearson narrates her story.
In the midst of a historic global refugee crisis, with nearly 69 million people forcibly displaced worldwide, Wendy Chan wanted to tell the human stories behind the mass exodus.
Many organizations are trying to tell the refugee story through numbers, but not a lot of them are reaching hearts and minds using really positive and celebratory tone, because amidst all these hardships, I think it's really important for us to showcase the incredible story of resilience and hope that refugees exhibited.
One Journey's inaugural festival took place last June on the grounds of the National Cathedral in Washington. Chan and her co-founder, Vanda Berninger, brought refugee dancers, musicians, and poets from all over the nation. 4,000 attended last year's festival. This year, partnering with 200 nonprofit organizations, local artists and businesses, and big global corporations, Chan expects more than 8,000 attendees. An important part of the festival is innovative digital technology.
We have Share Studio that will set up these digital portal where participants of the festival can connect and learn about the refugee stories directly from refugees who are sitting on the other side of the portal, who are still living at camps around the world.
We just went into the Digital Connect Lab. It was absolutely important and meaningful to my kids as they sat there and listened to what the men in there were experiencing. You could tell that they really wanted to understand the challenges they'd lived through and wanted to know how they might be able to help.
Chan was born in China and came to the U.S. with her family at age 12. She learned firsthand how important it is to support refugees.
My great-grandfather was a political prisoner who died in a political prison, at the age of 78. And my grandfather fled China during the Civil War as a refugee. To me, it's a very important that we all realize that refugees have no choice. They simply were born in the wrong place and wrong time of history.
Chan's enthusiasm was not unnoticed. Recently, she received Washington, D.C. Mayor's Volunteer Service Award.
I'm deeply honored to receive that award, but I wanted to make sure that we all know One Journey is truly a grassroots movement.
Chan, an executive at a global consulting firm, feels she has won life's lottery.
That I've been able to come to this country and live a really enriched life, a life that allows me to fulfill my full potential. And as someone who feels so blessed, who is so blessed in life, I just feel that I'm obligated to give them a hand.
For producer June So, I'm Carol Pearson, VOA News, Washington.
And that's our show for today, all dedicated to the World Refugee Day. Watch Africa 54 on our website at voaafrica.com. From all of us here in Washington, have a good evening.